good afternoon, or good morning, depending on your location. Welcome to the Farm Service Agency's Coronavirus Food Assistance Program for Dairy and Non-Specialty Crop Producers webinar. My name is Latrice Hill, and I serve as the National Director of Outreach for USDA's Farm Service Agency. Presenting with me today, we have Doug Kilgore and Brent Orr, both National Farm Program Managers here in the National FSA office. For today's webinar, please be reminded that all participants are in listen-only mode, but are able to submit questions through the chat box. We will answer as many questions as we can, but depending upon time, we may have to follow up with you later with a response. And also, as a reminder, there is a frequently asked questions page located on farmers.gov that may have some of the answers that you're looking for. Please take a look at that page prior to submitting any questions. Today's discussion will cover the program basics of the Coronavirus Food Assistance Program. We'll talk a little bit about the NOFA process, which stands for Notice of Funding Availability. And we will talk specifically on how dairy producers and non-specialty crop producers can apply for the program. Let's just get started with the basics. So what is the Coronavirus Food Assistance Program? Well, in response to the CARES Act, the Coronavirus Food Assistance Program, or CFAP, as we commonly refer to it, was developed to assist farmers, ranchers, and agricultural producers. As you all know, COVID-19 pandemic has impacted ag operations and humanity across the world in many ways. Well, here in the United States, this CFAP program works to address two challenges that our producers have faced from the virus, and that's one, price declines, and two, supply chain disruption. The pandemic has caused both a decline in demand for some commodities and affected the market supply chain. Some producers have had challenges in getting products to market before they spoiled, or had to dump milk from contracts getting canceled, or some may have been affected by school or restaurant closing. Whereas we know there won't be any program that makes us all whole again, this program does provide relief through direct payments and will cover a portion of the impact farmers and ranchers and producers have felt. To ensure funds serve as many producers as possible, producers whose applications are approved will receive 80% of their total maximum payment now, up to the program payment limit, and any additional will be determined by the Secretary and announced at a later date. To share some of the general program information before we go into specifics, it's important to know that FSA is currently accepting applications through August 28th. Sign-up began on May 26th of this year. And because FSA is working to ensure producers receive relief as soon as possible, FSA is not requiring documentation for the losses that are reported on the CFAP application. Producers will self-certify that this information is true and accurate. However, I will say that producers should endeavor to collect all and any information that they have, as there may be documentation required when USDA performs spot checks, or should the local county committee request to see this documentation. Once this documentation has been submitted, any outstanding forms or eligibility regarding the application will need to be resolved within 60 days of signing the application. One thing that I did want to make sure that I call out is that producers who have an interest in the operation should apply individually. Now, we're going to talk about this a little later because it's going to be different for a specific case, but please know that If producers, for example, are operating within a cooperative structure, then growers should apply individually to the program. Again, we'll talk about a caveat from that a little later. While an application can be submitted to any FSA office, it is the producer's office of record that will process the application. Now to talk a little bit about eligibility. FSA has identified commodities that are eligible for CFAP payments by identifying those commodities that experienced a 5% or greater national price decline as a result of COVID-19, or commodities that have had substantial marketing costs of inventory. It's important to note that this is not applicable for specialty crop categories 2 and 3. We held a specialty crop webinar earlier this week. Those slides and that recording will be posted in the next couple of days, but that will go into details about the specialty crop categories 2 and 3. Today, we're here to talk specifically on dairy and non-specialty crop producers. But FSA sought to identify all available price data, including prices collected by USDA and commodities traded on the futures market. So here on this slide, you can see some of the commodities that are eligible: milk, livestock, non-specialty crops, wool, and specialty crops. But to see a complete listing of all commodities and details of the non-specialty crops, visit www.farmers.gov/CFAP. There you can find the full listing. It's important to know that a producer is not required to be an existing USDA customer. Another thing that we've received questions about: producers who may have been in the midst of filing for bankruptcy or closing operations, but were still operating within mid-January through mid-April may still apply. Another common question that folks have asked is, what about SBA's programs? You know, I've been able to participate in them and receive payment. Does that mean that I can't participate in the CFAP program? Please know that participation in SBA's Paycheck Protection Program, or PPP, or the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program does not impact producer eligibility for CFAP or for any USDA farm program. That's important to note. This does not duplicate a provision, and it does not impact your ability to apply for CFAP. Entity eligibility information. Processing entities are ineligible. There is a payment limitation of $250,000 per person. And what's different from other FSA programs, some participants, such as corporations, LLCs, or corporate entities, are subject to special payment limitations. These categories may receive up to $750,000 based on the number of shareholders, which should not exceed 3, who contribute at least 400 hours of active person management or active labor. This next slide talks a little bit about commodities that are not eligible. So here you see sheep that are more than 2 years old, eggs, layers, soft red winter wheat, hard red winter wheat, white wheat, rice, flax, rye, peanuts, seed barley, ELS cotton, alfalfa, forage crops, hemp, and tobacco. These are commodities that are not deemed eligible for CFAP, but an important note, as you see, USDA may reconsider the excluded commodities if credible evidence is provided that supports a 5% price decline. We'll talk a little bit more later on about submitting documentations or credible evidence, but that is an important note for you to know. And for those who we may have a few specialty crop folks on the line. For those who are in those categories 2 and 3, you are not required to meet the 5% decline. Again, you'll learn a little bit more on that on the specialty crop recording. These payments, of course, are not expected to make producers whole or to compensate for all losses fully, but it is designed to give producers some financial relief. An important note is that if a producer has outstanding debts with USDA, they can still apply for the program if they're eligible. These payments will not be withheld to satisfy any USDA debts. So please know, regardless, these payments will not be used to satisfy any USDA debts, and they will not be offset. These payments do not have to be repaid. It's not a loan, so they do not have to be repaid. And there are no fees to apply for the program. Not all specialty crops or commodities were included in the CFAP program rule, and USDA actually needs assistance in identifying additional commodities that experience loss or market disruption. FSA has issued a Notice of Funds Availability, which is sometimes called a NOFA, N-O-F-A, to allow producers the opportunity to provide information on unlisted crops for consideration into the program. So this NOFA is what you might call a request for information. FSA needs more information to determine whether other commodities experience loss or market disruption to qualify to be a covered commodity under CFAP. So this call for data actually gives producers who grow commodities not currently eligible an opportunity to submit data on production, inventory prices, and market disruption. If approved, the new commodity will be added to the listing of eligible crops, and producers will have an opportunity to apply. We have a NOFA fact sheet that is posted on the CFAP webpage, which is the farmers.gov/CFAP site. What's important to know about this NOFA process is that comments and data must be submitted either online or by mail by June 22nd. That is very important. The deadline is June 22nd. A recent update was added to the NOFA, and it has been published on regulations.gov. But it's important to know that that deadline doesn't change. It is June 22nd. So if you are a producer who has a commodity that is currently not listed as being eligible for CFAP, and you have pricing evidence or information that shows that it did suffer a decline, more than a 5% decline, we do encourage you to submit that through the regulations.gov site online or by mail. And that NOFA fact sheet that I referenced that's on the farmers.gov site gives you the address and the link to either submit online or by mail. One thing that I do want to say before we leave this slide is that USDA is really interested in receiving information on data for nursery, aquaculture, and cut flower products. Now that I've gone over just some of the common basics about the program, I'd like to bring in Doug, who is our National Dairy and Special Programs Manager with FSA, to tell us a little bit about the specifics of
Hello? Can anybody hear me?
Hi, Doug.
Yes,
we
Doug,
can
go
hear
ahead.
you. Yep,
Hear you. Okay. Sorry, we lost you for a minute, Latrice. Hey, thanks, Latrice. Hey, folks, it's my pleasure to join you this afternoon or this morning, and whatever time zone you're in, and talk a little bit about CFAP Dairy. I think in general, the dairy part of CFAP is pretty intuitive and fairly easy to understand. So we'll move through these slides fairly quickly. First and foremost, let's talk about eligibility. And eligible dairy operations in the United States to commercially market milk from dairy cows are eligible for CFAP. Okay, so we're looking at dairy cow operations across the country. We're going to talk about eligible milk production, and we're looking at the milk produced for the months of January, February, and March 2020. We're going to use this base production throughout dairy CFAP. So again, these are the 3 months that we are really concerned about, and we're taking a look at and really determining eligible milk production. Additionally, I think we're all aware there's been a fair amount of dumped milk this year. Any dumped milk for the months of January through March is eligible for CFAP Dairy. In a lot of cases, that dumped milk may not be recorded on a milk marketing statement or a milk check stub, whatever you want to call it. So for those reasons, the dairy operation would actually use their own personal records. And any dumped milk, if it's in addition to any milk shipped, those numbers would be added up for the eligible milk production. I'm going to mention on the slide that dissolved dairy operations that meet eligibility requirements can apply. We're going to talk a little bit further about that in another slide. But yes, dairy operations that dissolve since January 1 are eligible for CFAP Dairy. Moving on to the next slide, and one of the first questions we get is, well, what about my involvement in dairy margin coverage, DMC, or dairy revenue, or LGM? Does that affect my participation in CFAP? And the answer is no. No. Dairy operations can participate in all those risk management programs and other insurance revenue programs, and they still maintain eligible for CFAP Dairy. Let's go into some general information, and I think most people with dairy backgrounds understand that there's a lot of joint venture dairy operations out there. And a lot of these joint venture dairy operations do operate without a tax identification number. Under CFAP Dairy, members will apply as individuals if they are affiliated with a joint dairy venture without a tax ID. Again, each member would apply. Each member can apply for their pounds of milk production. And we're going to touch on that a little bit in another example. But again, it's worth mentioning that joint dairy ventures may apply, but they apply as members. If it's a joint venture, yes,
Doug?
sir.
Hi,
yes.
This is Latrice. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, I have a quick question for you. I see that you said they will apply as individuals.
Yes.
How does that work for married couples? What would they do?
Well, for CFAP Dairy, we're looking at the name of the person or entity whose name is on that milk marketing statement. Those individuals or entities or joint ventures are the persons that receive the milk marketing statement and milk check. So consequently, those individuals or entities or joint ventures are eligible for CFAP. So if it's a husband and wife operation, however, the milk check is in the husband's name only, the husband whose name is on the milk check would be eligible for CFAP Dairy. So I think that answers your question. Yep.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. Before we move on to the next slide, some joint venture dairy operations do operate with a tax ID number. and those dairy operations would apply as one dairy operation for CFAP. So, okay? And again, any questions on any of these types of issues, our county offices are more than helpful to come to a decision on these. We thought it was worth mentioning on the dairy portion of CFAP to talk about or just mention that there are other areas that probably most dairy operations will be eligible for other things as part of CFAP. Dairy cattle no longer used for dairy production, and most people know what they are. They're call cows. Those cows that enter the beef market are eligible for CFAP payment under CFAP livestock category. So that's another funding source for dairy operations under CFAP. Following my presentation, Mr. Brenor will talk about the non-specialty crops. And again, under that scenario, those folks that grow hay, silage, grain, whatever, may be eligible for a CFAP payment under the CFAP non-specialty crop category. Moving on. Let's talk a little bit about payment and just to give you some background on the CFAP payment. CFAP provides financial assistance to dairy operations due to the market decline of the all milk price in the first quarter of calendar year 2020, and compensation for marketing channel disruption due to the coronavirus pandemic. The payment is in two parts. Part one is funded by CARES Act and pays for the price decline for dairy producers eligible milk production in January, February, and March 2020, as we've talked about before, and there's that base production that we mentioned. For Part 2, it is funded by CCC and pays for a price decline for a dairy producer's estimated increased milk production in April, May, and June. And this is calculated through a USDA adjustment to a producer's January, February, and March 2020 production. And we'll take a little closer look at that in another slide. But again, there is a slight increase for production for that second quarter production of April, May, and June. These applications result in one total payment. However, as mentioned before, once this application is submitted, producers will receive 80% of that eligible payment, subject to payment limitations, of course. But again, 80% will come out the door initially.
Hey, Doug, it's me again.
Yes,
and it looks like you're probably about to cover this on the next slide. But going back to the previous slide, looking at Part 1 and Part 2, my question was going to be, can dissolved dairies get Part 2 of this payment?
Yeah, it depends. For dissolved dairies, it depends on when they actually dissolve. And why don't we move to the next slide? That way I think it's a nice lead into the next slide where I'm talking about dissolved dairy operations. Those operations that dissolve after January 1, 2020 are eligible for their pounds of milk produced. Now let's first talk about those dairy operations that dissolve in the time frame of January, February, or March. Those operations are eligible for Part 1 funding, period. They're not eligible for Part 2 because they were not producing milk for the second quarter. So again, and just to reinforce that, dairy operations that resolve January through March are eligible for their pounds of milk produced for Part 1 funding only and not Part 2. Now moving on to those dairy operations that dissolve in the second quarter, which is after March 30th and before July 1. Those folks are eligible for the Part 1 payment, and they're also eligible for a prorated payment for Part 2. And this depends on the number of days they produce milk. Again, for these operations for Part 2 who dissolve in that second quarter, it's actually a prorated payment that is involved to come up with that Part 2 payment. But again, I think it's pretty clear from a program perspective. It all depends on when you dissolve and how that payment is calculated. But again, to reinforce the final comment is dissolved dairy operations will receive some funding through CFAP. Moving on to documentation, and we want to be clear on this. And we talk about lots of things that are needed to help dairy producers come up with their information, but this is a self-certification program. It's up to the dairy operations and producers to self-certify the information that is put on the application. It is important because I think most people are aware we do spot checks. If you were called upon to do a spot check, you need to have some information put aside that if you're called upon that you could come up with that. So again, there's a responsibility on dairy operations and producers to have their information set aside just in case a spot check would be in place. But again, I want my final comment. This is a producer certification program. Moving on. I just talked about, certification, but we put this in here because we think it's helpful for dairy operations to know where to look to come up with the information they need to enter into dairy CFAP. So certainly, as we talked about before, the milk marketing statements for the months of January, February, and March, they're certainly key documents any dairy operation needs to apply. Another record that is important for those dairy operations that have dump milk, and if that dump milk was not listed on a milk marketing statement, those records are important to have to help come up with a monthly pounds record when you're applying for CFAP. And again, as I mentioned in the previous slide, these documents are not required at sign up because this application is a self-certification. All right, we're going to move on to a couple examples. I think to try to bring everything together. First example, we're going to talk about 100-cow dairy farms. Certainly, there's plenty of them scattered across the U.S. In this scenario, Easy Dairy did not dump any milk for the three months in 2020. You can see their milk production is as follows, and they shipped a little over 500,000 pounds during January through March. In this scenario, all this milk is eligible for CFAP, and Easy Dairy will certify to this milk production on the AD 3114 form on items 7, 8, and 9. Again, it's pretty, I think, as intuitive as it can be, and I think it's from that perspective, it's pretty important to understand. Let's move on to example 2. We discussed before joint ventures. Let's look at this joint venture example to kind of understand how a joint venture would play out. Here we're using McDonald Family Dairy Farm. It's a 250-cow dairy operation. They operate without a tin. So hopefully if you were listening earlier, that's a flag which tells you that the members have to apply individually for CFAP. Under this example, Old McDonald owns 90%, and his son Sam owns 10%. They come in, they provide their eligible pounds of milk production for January, February, and March based on their ownership share, and they individually apply. In this scenario, McDonald family did not dump any milk, so we don't have to worry about those pounds. But as you can see, we have their pounds listed, and that on this slide is their monthly pounds as a whole. So you can see the production there. Let's move to the next slide as we kind of complete the joint venture scenario here. Okay, Old McDonald and Sam McDonald will each certify to the following on their individual CFAP forms. And as you remember, from the previous slide, they had 1.3 million pounds of milk production. For Old McDonald, we're going to take that number times 90%, and that gives you Old McDonald's pounds, which is a little over 1.1 million pounds. For Sam, he owns 10%. So we're taking that total pounds number times 10%, and we come up with 130,500 pounds. So that's the breakdown of the joint venture. Certainly this milk production reporting will be broken out by January, February, and March months. But again, that's how we get to those final number of pounds for the joint venture dairy operation. Moving on to the next example, and here we're dealing with a large dairy and an example of a payment limitation that was mentioned earlier, and we're going to get into it a little bit more on the next slide. But here we have Sky's the Limit Dairy. It's a large dairy operation. They ship around 100 million pounds a year. Their milk production it's a little over 8 million pounds for the months of January, February, and March, with their 3-month production being 24.7 million pounds. Sky's the Limit total calculated payment is $1.531,543 and 26 cents. But keep in mind, under this scenario, the 250,000 pay limit does apply. Now, depending on the makeup of Sky's the Limit Dairy, they may earn up to $750,000 if the ownership interest in the organizational structure provides at least 400 hours of active personal labor, personal management, or a combination thereof. So again, it depends on the ownership interest and what effort is being put forth in that operation, which determines that. And our final example, we're getting into dump milk, and we thought it was important to put an example up here where a producer did dump some milk, and how would he add that up to eventually apply for CFAP. In this case, Joe Dairyman dumped 2 days of milk in March 2020, and certainly there was plenty of milk dumped in March and April. His pounds on his March marketing statement were 70,000, and he dumped 5,000 pounds in March, but that was not recorded on the milk marketing statement. That was from personal records he had. So Joe Dairyman, when he enters the CFAP form entry for March 2020, his production number will be 75,000 pounds. I think that's pretty easy to understand. I hope this was informative, and certainly moving forward, if you have any questions, feel free to contact me. We'll pass this on to the next presenter, Patrice.
Well, Doug, thank you. Before you go, I've got one more clarification that I'm going to need from you. I'm going back to the married couples here. What happens if both of their names are on the milk check? Would they apply separately for CFAP or just do one application?
It would really depend on their structure. If they are really a true joint venture, then they would fall under the joint venture discussion that we had as far as splitting out the pounds per member. Okay. If it's not a true joint venture and say a sole proprietorship, they would be under one dairy operation, apply as one organization.
Okay. One more question. I'm gonna let you go. I'm just thinking about seasonal dairies and how they would be eligible. So if a seasonal dairy that doesn't milk cows until March and April and don't have base production, how would they participate, or could they?
We've not allowed any special exceptions for seasonal dairy. If a seasonal dairy has milk produced or produce milk for any of the months of January, February, and March, they are eligible for those pounds of milk produced through CFAP. And that's really the answer to the question.
Okay. Well, thank you.
Okay.
Thanks so much. We appreciate, Doug, you covering dairy for us. And now we're going to hear from Brent Orr, who is the National Risk and Production Program Manager. He's going to talk to us about non-specialty crops. Brent, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Latrice. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, you sound good.
Okay, thanks. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Glad to be here to talk to you about the non-specialty crops, and really wool falls under my purview as well. We're here to talk about the CFAP program, which was enacted, as you've already heard, to compensate producers for production that was devalued because of COVID-19. There are some eligible commodities, and there's a couple of questions asked in the chat that I'll address now. About forage, corn, or any eligible commodity that was taken for silage or hay is eligible for CFAP. Malting barley is an exception to that, because malting barley, as we define it, is something that is barley that was delivered to a malting facility. So that's the one exception to that. But you can see there the eligible commodities: the canola corn, malting barley, canola corn, cotton, millet, oats, soybeans, sorghum, sunflowers, durum wheat, and hard red spring wheat. And those are the only two types of wheat that are eligible. Unharvested crops for 2019 are not eligible. We got to have production, and that production must, and the reason we have to do it that way is because that production must have been affected by a price decline that because of COVID-19. As I said earlier, commodities used on the farm, such as silage, are eligible for CFAP. So we've been getting that question quite often. And grazing commodities, any of those crops taken for grazing are not eligible for CFAP. That was provided for us early on. You can see there the website that has those eligible commodities. I encourage you to visit that site, farmers.gov /CFAP. Frequently, if you have questions about this program, there's a lot of good information there. CFAP provides payment, as I've already said, for price decline and marketing costs for inventories. There's two separate components of this, and you'll notice this when you see an application. One of it is the CARES Act payment rate, which was passed by Congress for a specific purpose of covering these kinds of losses. And then CCC, or Commodity Credit Corporation, which is who provides most of the funding for the programs that are administered by FSA, ponied up some money to match that too. So there's two different payment rates. There's actually two different types of payments. I think Doug probably hit on this earlier, but there will be two separate payments, and they will be totaled into one. Those payment rates are listed there at that website. Like I said, you can visit that website. Adding more to the backslash there to the non-specialty will get you to that specific information. And if you have all these non-specialty crops, they will be totaled up and summed up into one payment that you will be issued. To calculate a payment, we have to have two pieces of information from you. We have to have your eligible commodities 2019 unpriced inventory as of January the 15th. So all that commodity that was on hand on January the 15th, that was subject to price risk that you still own, but that cannot exceed 50% of, and that's the other piece of information that you'll have to provide to the county office, is that we need to know your 2019 total production for that commodity, because your eligible payment amount cannot exceed 50% of the total production for the farm, for you for 2019 crop year. So if you'll see that little graphic there, the CFAP payment for non-specialty crops is the commodity in bushels times 50% times the payment rate for CARES, and then the other segment of that is the CCC payment rate, and you sum those up together, and it gets you what your CFAP payment will be. As Doug alluded to earlier, we're relying on you to certify these production amounts. There's the application is actually AD Form 3114, which is kind of irrelevant to you, but that's in government. You deal in numbers and a lot, so that's the form number. You'll be required to fill out items 15 and 16 for those eligible commodities for my part of this program for non-specialty crops. And in that, as we discussed earlier, you'll be providing to your county office the 2019 production in bushels for all of that commodity, and then the 2019 production is still in inventory as of January the 15th. So that's two important, the two important items that you'll have to have for non-specialty crops and wool. Members apply.
Brent,
yes.
Brent, I'm sorry. I have a question, and I'm sorry. I'm going to be popping in with questions as you go along. Going back, I see where they have to report in bushels for total 19. As far as the bushels, do producers have to convert to the bushels themselves, or how is that conversion? How does that take place? Is it something that the producer does, or does the office do that?
Well, it probably works out better with both of them being involved in this computation. We have a list of conversion factors for most all commodities. I say most all because some of the millet has been something that has eluded me as far as finding a conversion factor. But for most of the main commodities, we have a conversion factor that converts tons of silage or tons of hay to bushels of product. The county offices have those conversion factors. So if they can discuss that with their county office when they're making an application, that's where they should, that'd be the best way to handle it.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Some general information. Members apply as individuals, and they should apply for the payment or for the portion that they own. You're doing your ownership share. So when we say apply as individuals, you could be farming as an entity, you could be farming as a corporation, partnership, so forth. That entity should apply, and you apply for that portion that you have ownership interest in. So if if certain situations, two people farm and have 50% of the commodity is one person and 50% is the other, then you would apply for only your 50% and not the entire amount. Something that's a point of contention or something that's a point of discussion that's a hot topic, you would say. I get a lot of questions on this. The inventory that has to be unpriced as of January the 15th, 2020. And the reason for that is because we're looking at a price decline that, so if you had it before January the 15th and locked in a price, then that specific part of that commodity production would not be eligible. There's a lot of different components. There's a lot of different types of contracts. And we have some good information on our website that shows what types of contracts are eligible and what types are not eligible for CFAP. So I'd encourage you to visit that website there and see where, if you have a contract that's involved in that, where it would fall. The one thing to remember is the next to the bottom bullet there, any contract that has a potential for futures loss is considered to have price risk, and that commodity is subject to price risk. So that's what we're basically looking for. As we said earlier, hay and silage that are used on the farm are eligible. Everything that we've got to have is reported in bushels. And that must be, if you have tons of silage, then that has to be converted to bushels. That's what we're paying on. RMA may have done that for you, but I would encourage you to visit your local FSA office, and there you can see that your conversion factors are there. I have a couple of quick examples to speak to some of this. Jordan Farmer has two farms, one located in Kosciuszko County, Iowa, and one farm located in Grenada County, Mississippi, which is where I'm from, just for giggles. Jordan Farmer has 100% ownership in 4,000 bushels of corn and grown in Iowa, and 50% of that, of the ownership interest of the 5,000 bushels grown in Mississippi. In that particular example, Jordan Farmer will report 6,500 bushels as the total production on our farm for 2019. Continuing this example, of the 6,500 bushels that are in the bins, Jordan executed a forward contract on 5,000 bushels of it on January the 10th, which locked in a specific price. So that price was not subject to any kind of price fluctuation after January, on January the 15th or afterwards. So that 5,000 bushels is ineligible for CFAP. So on his application, Jordan would say that there are 1,500 bushels left that are as production not sold as of January 15th, 2020. So that would be the two amounts that we would do, and we would compute payments based on that according to the prior examples we had. Corn for silage. Danny Farmer cuts 100 acres of corn for silage. Danny reports that I had 1,625 tons of silage was harvested on those 100 acres. It was a mild winter, and Danny didn't have to use as much silage and still had 1,000 tons remaining on the farm on January the 15th. 1,625 tons converted to bushels is our conversion factor is 7.94 equals 12,903 bushels for 2019, and the 1,000 tons converted to bushels is 7,940 bushels for 2019, production not sold, and that would be the two entries that will be made on the form for to compute the payment. That's the end of my example, Latrice.
I've got a couple of questions for you. What about haylage? Is haylage eligible?
Yes, there's anything that was harvested from one of these commodities is eligible for CFAP, except for if the commodity uses grazing.
Okay, great. That helps. I know we talked about hay and silage, but I just wondered if haylage qualifies. I really do appreciate you coming on and giving us some real-life examples. Hopefully we'll have a little time at the end to ask a few more questions. I want to move on now to a little bit more general information. One of the things that we've talked about or alluded to is about this CFAP calculator. This is a calculator that is a spreadsheet, actually, an Excel spreadsheet that the producer can use to load all of their crops in order to populate the actual CFAP application. That calculator spreadsheet is on the farmers.gov /CFAP website that we've been saying today. With that spreadsheet, I want to keep in mind to everyone that regardless of how many crops or commodities you may have, let's say that you have dairy, you have tomatoes, and you have hay, which would be three separate commodities, you would still put that in one file of that spreadsheet because it will populate into one application. You don't want to have three different applications, just one. So make sure that you include all of your eligible commodities in that one file. Forms and documentation. Of course, the AD 3114, which is the actual application that's generated, it's the most important form. But again, as I mentioned, it is part of that calculator, so it's automatically generated from the calculator. But to comply with the maximum payment limitation and our adjusted gross income provisions as applicable for this program, there are some other forms that you potentially will have to complete. And I just want to quickly go through some of these forms to let you know what they mean or exactly what they're for. The member information, CCC 901, identifies members of a farm or ranch that is a legal entity. Member information will be completed by legal entities and joint operations to collect the member name, addresses, tax ID numbers, and citizenship. The CCC 941 reports your average adjusted gross income for programs where income restrictions may apply. The CCC 942, if applicable, this certification reports income from farming or ranching or forestry for those who exceed the adjusted gross income limitation. The AD 1026 is our highly erodible land and wetland determination form, which is a conservation compliance form. The AD 2047 provides basic customer contact information. And my favorite, and the most important one that I think you will agree, is the SF 3881, which collects your banking information. This is the direct deposit form. And by submitting this form, this ensures that USDA is able to make that payment to you via direct deposit. Important note, if you are a producer who may have already participated in an FSA or NRCS program and you have your farm already registered with FSA, there may be potential that you may not have to complete a lot of these forms. Some of these forms may already be on file for you. So in that case, you may want to call ahead of time to see if those forms are applicable for you. But do keep in mind, you must use that CFAP calculator for the application. A few helpful tools. We've said it 100 times. The farmers.gov /CFAP is a very good tool, but there's also a frequently asked questions page, which has a lot of the questions that I've been seeing coming in today. A lot of those questions have already been answered and are on that website. That website is updated often, so we encourage you to take a look at it to see if there are some questions, some answers there for questions that you may have. One thing that you may not know if you're not used to doing business with us is that we also have our regulations and policy available to the public. It's online on our FSA website, so at any time you can look at handbook amendments and policies as well as changes issued through notices. We want you to know that you are able to get assistance to apply for the CFAP program at any time. You can feel free to call our customer call center, and I'll talk a little bit about that on the next slide, but we actually have a call center where you can call with all kinds of questions. It's important to know that offices right now are open for phone appointments only. As you are beginning to see across the country, some operations and offices are beginning to reopen and get back to normal, but for right now, phone appointments are the way that you communicate. That's the way that you would communicate with our staff. And we understand that that's a challenge. You know, there are some limitations. All of this time, we've had FSA staff, limited staff in the offices, so there may be one or more than two people in the office. So we ask that you understand that as we begin to open up and resume normal operations, that there has been limited staff, and they are working quickly to process your applications. So that's why it's so important for you to utilize this customer care center number and call that number to get some of the answers to those questions that you may have. For those producers who may have limited English proficiency, I'm so sorry, I'm getting tongue-tied. Limited English proficiency. There is a language interpretation line available to use that. They would call that customer care center number and press 1 to identify the language that they need and 2 for Spanish. There are also some USDA videos on YouTube that you'll find posted on the CFAP site. Those have been closed captioned for several different languages. You just need to select the language that you need. The customer call center that I referenced a while ago, the number for that is 877-508-8364. This actually allows you the opportunity to speak with one of our staff. We've got field staff from across the country manning the phone lines, and we really identified this for producers who are new to USDA or FSA and may have questions about the process. You're able to get quick information, and if needed, they can even connect you with the office, the local office that serves your county, and you can schedule an appointment there. The application can be completed online. You can submit everything online. If you go to that CFAP website, that webpage, it tells you how to submit electronically. And any additional information that the office may need, they may contact you through email or give you a call. But it's important to know that you can submit everything digitally, but call the office first to let them know that you will be transmitting it because there is a secure process we have in place to secure and upload forms directly to the office through a secured box, a secured site. So you want to connect either with the hotline or the county office first so that you can upload that information securely. The CFAP calculator is actually located on the farmers.gov /CFAP website. Also on that site is a video that shows you how to use the calculator. So everything that we've talked about today, you'll be able to find on that farmers.gov /CFAP website. So if you're new to FSA, you probably don't know that for most of our programs, we require a farm number for program participation. What's very unique about this program is that that is not required. You do not have to have a farm number to apply. However, it depends on the compliance form, if there's any highly erodible conservation or wetland determination made, there may be a chance that you have to come back and actually comply with those environmental regulations, and to do that, you would have to have a farm record established. But no, you do not have to have a farm number to participate in the program. I think most of this we've already gone over. I'm trying to go through these last things and try to answer a couple of your questions too. Will you be able to see the questions and answers anywhere else? What we plan to do is to submit this to the webmaster of farmers.gov, where they have the frequently asked questions already posted. We don't want to duplicate, but if these are new questions that the team feel would be very informative for other producers, then we'll make sure that they get it, and they will post it there on the frequently asked page.
Hey, Latrice, can I make one statement before we start into these questions? There were some questions have been asked about haylage and baleage and some terms I'm not familiar with, but I want to be perfectly clear here is that the commodity has to be on the list of eligible commodities that we discussed earlier in my presentation for it to be eligible for CFAP, and then we can talk about if it was taken for hay or if it was taken for silage. So just plain old grass hay at this point is not eligible for CFAP. So I don't want there to be any confusion, and I've answered the questions in the question and answer that way, but I don't want there to be any confusion about that. For the for the commodity to get a CFAP payment, it must be on our list of eligible commodities harvested as grain, hay or silage, seed in certain situations, but it must be harvested that way before it is eligible for CFAP. You got to go to those lists of eligible commodities to determine if what you're harvesting is actually eligible for CFAP. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. That question popped up a number of times, and I wanted to address it.
Yes, that's great. Thanks so much for clarifying that. And again, to see that listing of eligible commodities, you would need to go to the farmers.gov /CFAP. There you will find not just the listing, but there's also what we call the rule. You know, every time USDA implements a program, there are specific rules that we have to publish publicly on the Federal Register. So a copy of that Federal Register, a copy of the cost and benefit analysis, all of that is on the farmers.gov /CFAP page. That way you're able to download. You can see everything about this program, all of the eligible commodities, how those commodities came about being on that list, the cost analysis that was done. All of that is available publicly on that site. So we do encourage you to go there to see if your commodity is listed. This is just a quick order of events that shows you what happens. Of course, you will access the application either online. If you're unable to get it online, you may request it by telephone, email, or electronically. But the first thing that I would suggest you do is to check those online resources. Schedule an appointment with the local office. That's not required, but if needed, schedule an appointment. We want you to make sure that you reach out to the hotline, the customer care center, who may be able to provide you with immediate assistance as you begin filling out the application in the different forms. Once you've submitted that application, it goes to the county office and they begin reviewing and processing. Please keep in mind that this program is being implemented nationally, so all of our county offices are working feverishly trying to process your application. I can't promise you how quickly they'll get to it, but our goal is to have it to you as soon as possible. But once they process it, if there are any questions or follow-up forms or documentation needed, they will follow up with you. If you have an appointment, then you will attend that appointment and they'll let you know of any additional information that's needed. And then that's when they will review it for approval or disapproval. If approved, then you will receive 80% of that eligible payment, and it will be processed through direct deposit. Again, I think I just went over this. What happens after I sign that application? There will be 60 days that you have to resolve any eligibility issues, anything that the county office may ask you for additional information or clarification on. You have 60 days from the day you submit that application to resolve that. Again, approved applications are sent for processing, and then it is processed and paid by direct deposit. Tips for success, we can't say it enough. farmers.gov/CFAP. That is all things to apply to understand this program is on that website. The video of the CFAP application generator is there, as well as the payment calculator. The application generator, again, is an Excel spreadsheet that generates into the AD 3114 form. You do not have to use that, but it is highly recommended. It would be easier for you. It is created to make it easier and simpler for you. If you should need anything mailed to you, contact that 877 customer care line, and they can have an application mailed to you instead of doing it online if you're unable to access it online. But one thing that I really, really want you to remember, if your crop is not listed as an eligible commodity on the list, remember you do have the opportunity to submit it through the NOFA request for information process. So go to that website, that farmers.gov website, to click on the regulations.gov link to submit that evidence that you have, that pricing data information you have for your particular commodity or crop. Those will be accepted through June 22nd. We went a little over time, but we really are happy that you were able to participate with us. In the future, if you would like to learn more about FSA programs and all of the different webinars that we offer, this is the way to subscribe directly to the FSA outreach webinars. You would copy this link, fsa.usda.gov/subscribe. You would enroll your email address and select Outreach and Education. That allows you to get our updates, that allows you to get our newsletters, and it keeps you informed on when we post things and when we host different webinars. A recording of this webinar will be made available once it's transcribed. That's usually the process. All of our webinars have to be transcribed and closed captioned. Once that is completed, we will post it on the webinar page, as well as a copy of the slides that were presented in this presentation. The next webinar we have coming up will be on Tuesday, which will cover livestock and non-specialty crop producers. So there will be another bite at the apple for non-specialty crop, but they'll specifically be for livestock and non-specialty crop. So feel free to go to the webinar page, register for that webinar as well, and there will be a final webinar on Thursday which will cover all of the program flexibilities that FSA has made during COVID. You know, we're talking about CFAP, but we have other programs which is not part of the CARES Act. It's where FSA has identified within existing authorities flexibilities that we can offer our producers during this time. So anything from farm loans to marketing assistance loans to even some of our sister agencies, the Natural Resource Conservation Service, they have some programs which they are offering flexibility. So if you're interested in learning about that, be sure to sign up for the webinar on next Thursday. Just go to our webinar page at fsa.usda.gov/outreach and click on webinars. Thanks so much for participating. Until next time, goodbye.